Good morning, everyone. It is wonderful to be with you all here in Colombo. And I'd like to thank our host, Mr. Sashi Ramahajendran and Siobhan Daniel, for pulling this event together and bringing us all here in person to discuss these critical issues, human trafficking and modern slavery, and how it impacts this region. At its core, the Bali Process Government and Business Forum is a platform for collaboration. It's really about bringing people together to understand how we can tackle these issues, how we can work, how bring in the private sector together with government to create lasting change. The last time the Government and Business Forum met was in August in Bali, where we were hosted by Mr. Thahir to discuss the issues relating to technology, the opportunities and challenges that it presents. I believe it was in this session that Siobhan Daniel made the bold claim that Sri Lanka was the most beautiful island in the region. This was a fairly bold claim because we were sitting in beautiful surroundings in Bali, but luckily our Indonesian host took this with good humour. But as the Bali Process Government and Business Forum, we took it upon ourselves to investigate whether this claim was true. So I've managed to have the last week here in Sri Lanka, and I have seen beaches, jungle, temples, elephants, and I can in fact confirm that it is an incredibly beautiful country. So thank you. I don't want to cause a diplomatic incident here, so I'm not going to comment on whether it is in fact the most beautiful, but I feel very privileged to be with you all here today and to be able to talk about these issues in person. As part of this tour, this research that I conducted, I also had the privilege of visiting Capital Maharaja Group's Gammadda initiative, where they were laying the foundations to build a bridge in a rural community. And what struck me about this project and about the way they operate was not so much that they had come in and decided to build a bridge, but they had talked to the community. They had asked them what they needed, what they wanted. And as I reflected on that and thought about why we're all here today and what we're trying to do through the Bali Process Government and Business Forum, I thought that's something that we need to remember, that talking to the people that are impacted, talking to people with lived experience needs to be at the heart of everything that we do. We can't impose our own solutions. We need to listen and we need to respond to the needs of the most vulnerable. So I'd like to kick us off today by running you through a high-level overview of how modern slavery impacts our region. While our region is host to many beautiful islands, it is also host to the highest number of people living in modern slavery. As you heard Dr. Forrest mention before, our estimates are that there are now 50 million people living in modern slavery around the world. 30 million of those are in the Asia-Pacific region. 28 million of those are in forced labour and 22 in forced marriages, while 12 million are children. Turning to our region, which will come up soon. As I mentioned, there's close to 30 million people living in modern slavery in this region alone. You can see there the splits between forced labour and forced marriage and the heat map showing where modern slavery is most prevalent. If you'd like to find out more about the global estimates of modern slavery and the Global Slavery Index, these are publications that Walk Free publishes, and the Walk Free team are outside at the booth and willing to show you the data if you'd like to learn more. The Global Slavery Index looks at the prevalence of modern slavery at the country level, as well as how governments are responding. And we give governments ratings in terms of which laws and policies they've implemented and how they can improve. I'd like to also reflect on the fact that our region is very diverse. If you think about the Bali process, roughly 45 countries, modern slavery looks very different in every country. We have many countries that send hundreds of thousands of migrant workers abroad, and many of them face situations of extreme exploitation, forced labour and other forms of modern slavery. We've also heard this morning about other forms of trafficking, such as the Sri Lankans who had been trafficked to fight on the front lines of the war in the Ukraine, as well as those who have been trafficked and forced to work in scamming centres across Southeast Asia. But when we talk about modern slavery, the one thing that they all have in common is that people's freedom has been taken away. It's generally not taken away through physical restraint, but through deceit, violence, coercion, and abuse of power. And that's what we mean when we talk about modern slavery. It covers a range of crimes, including human trafficking, forced labour, child labour, forced marriage, slavery, and slavery-like practices. Often people, as I said, are not physically trapped, but it is their freedom that has been withheld. I'd now like to turn to our panel to get their overview of how modern slavery is impacting our region, and also to talk about some of their insights in terms of how we can respond to these challenges. Ambassador Bell, if I could start with you, what are some of the key challenges that you see our region facing? And if you could also share with us how the Bali process is responding to those challenges. Thank you.
Thank you. I think that Hello? Oh, sorry, I've got it now. I think when we look at the statistics that Walk Free, IOM, ILO have been involved in compiling, which shows the millions of people in modern slavery and slavery-like conditions across our region, we come quickly to understand that there are so many complex challenges that contribute to this situation. So when I think about it in a global perspective, I think about the UNHCR's figures released last year on global forced displacement. And the UNHCR has published a figure of 110 million people globally in situations of forced displacement. So we see many people across the world in increasingly vulnerable situations. And the impact of crises, forced displacement, and instability globally increases opportunities for organised crime, for human traffickers, and for people who are unfortunately engaging in extremely exploitative practices. So we see instability, crisis and forced displacement rising, and as Dr. Andrew Forrest said this morning, unfortunately what appears to be a rising curve too of instances of human trafficking. We see the impact of climate change in this also. Climate change impacting mobility, labour mobility, people's comfort at home, and as people become increasingly vulnerable and move, that also increases opportunities for these kind of exploitative practices to happen. Unfortunately, we also know that organised crime that leads to these practices, human trafficking and others, is extremely profitable. The International Labour Organisation published a report in April, and in that report it said that the annual global profits of forced labour are now at US $263 billion. So there are massive profits being derived by organised criminal groups, and we need to take concerted action to make sure that we're clamping down on that, law enforcement action, prosecution action, and stopping the rivers of profit that's derived from extremely exploitative practices, not only on people who are very, very vulnerable because they've become displaced or because they're in situations of poverty, but now we're seeing very changed cohorts too across our region. So people are being targeted who are multilingual. People are targeted because they have great IT skills and because they're looking for economic opportunities. So we know quite well that there's a whole lot of deceptive recruitment happening online and a whole lot of practices that involve the use of technology, which we're all working to try and combat. So challenges related to encrypted messaging services, new forms of electronic financial transfers, and things which make investigation of these crimes very difficult. So we're continuing to try in the technological sphere to stay one step ahead of criminals in this domain. And that was really highlighted at the Government and Business Forum Tech Forum, which was hosted by Mr. Garibaldi Tohir in Bali last year, the previous GABIF summer event. So we need to be working closely, as Indonesia has really highlighted for us last year, with social media influencers, with tech companies, and with others that are using modern day technologies to exploit the very real people who live amongst us in our communities, and as Dr. Forrest said this morning, are people with families, who are parents, who are children, and possibly known to some of us too. Because we've seen the rise of people trafficked into online scam centres, particularly in some Southeast Asian countries, and it involves thousands of our nationals. The Bali process involves 45 member countries and 4 member organisations, and so this is a shared problem that impacts all of us, and we're all working very hard to do that. Through the Government and Business Forum, we're really working also to tackle challenges associated with the business supply chains. It's very difficult to interrogate what's become a very complex business supply chain often now for many goods produced around our world, and it's hard to be sure as we look deeper into those supply chains whether they are indeed free of modern slavery practices or forced labour. So I think that one of the key things that we're doing through the Government and Business Forum within the Bali process is to really help look at those supply chains, to raise awareness of these, and to work within the 3 recommendations that the GABF works toward: acknowledge, act and advance. Acknowledge that the problem is there, it's global and that it impacts us all. Act so that we make a real difference in our world, and this summit today goes toward that effort, and to advance solutions that are sustainable and will help us bring that curve down, as Dr. Forrest said this morning, into the future ahead. Thank you.
Thanks so much, Lynn. And yes, we will be talking more about supply chains and the AAA recommendations in a later session today, but thank you for raising that one. And thank you also for your comments around modern slavery not really existing in isolation, and the threat multipliers that we need to think about: conflict, climate change. I think it's really essential that we consider those as we talk about the issues today. I'll now turn to Vice Admiral Pereira, Commander of the Sri Lankan Navy. As Commander of the Navy, you oversee operations relating to both human trafficking and people smuggling, and dangerous sea routes. Could you please share with us some insight on these issues? And I believe you have some slides to share.
Thank you very much, Serena. As you started earlier on, you were mentioning about, before moving on to the question, Kamadda.
Yes.
Now, the Navy also engaging in naval, the social responsibility, and Kamadda is one of my stakeholders. We just did, one of my stakeholders, 1,000th RO plants, the reverse osmosis plants. The 1,000th one was just commissioned in one of the remote villages. So, one of the major means of getting either illegal migrants from source country, destination, or receiving country is either by land or air, but mainly through the ocean. The sea routes are what that's happened. So as we can see, the state border is one place that you can stop it. While in the progress, in the transit, you can stop it at sea or on land. And as it enters to the destination country, the other place that you can stop it. This is a very precarious, dangerous journey, a passage that they take thousands of miles from the source country to the other. You don't know what lies on the way for those unfortunate souls that are taking the passage. I'm sure what we know about, few that are arriving at some country, but we don't know how many thousand that were not arrived. So it's that dangerous, one of the main key issue. So when we are looking at Sri Lanka, I can show you some of the examples where the routes are. We have seen in 2009, after the protracted conflict in this country, the flow was mainly towards Australia. In 2010 to 2012, it's peaked up. Yes, it's peaked up. So, and the other destination that these traffickers find convenient to go is the the French Reunion Island. So if you look at the distances over 1,800 nautical miles, and on that side nearly 3,000 nautical miles, this is a journey on a small boat, which is a fishing boat in that case, in a rough sea, very, very dangerous. So if we go to the next slide. Now this is the number over a period of 2009 up to 2023 that we have prevented as the border, as I showed earlier, prevented leaving. The more numbers may have arrived at the receiving countries. Sizable number, as you can see, attempted to move out. Mostly, if you look at the reasons, are economic reasons. You were talking about the trafficking, but this does not happen as trafficking. It's obviously illegal migration by sea. All these people are potential illegal immigrants. But what happens when you reach, if you reach, is a question. Sometimes now the Australian system is like, they return back, but some other countries, but if they keep them, organizers at this end, this, a complicated process, they may pay you some, 2 million or whatever part of that, but when they reach somehow, then they get held up onto a sort of a servitude. So all the huge debts that, have to pay back. So what you engage up there perhaps amount to trafficking, because what you engage there is not what you exactly wish to work by reaching another country. So the servitude, the debt payment back home. So as Your Excellency mentioned, this is a huge network. So, even at the illegal migrants that you arrive, but you might ended up as a, end product, I would say, of trafficking, although the act is not trafficking. So we all know that, there are, in the burden of proof, you have to have an act, the means, and the purpose. So if you find that, they engage in something that they really don't want, it amounts to trafficking. Can we move up to the next? Yeah, this is again the same numbers and the Australian routes. This is a serious concern when we look at the maritime challenges for Sri Lanka. I think the Sri Lanka Navy and the Sri Lanka Coast Guard engage seriously on preventing that. And when we look at the last 12 months, it's zero numbers attempting from, that doesn't say that, there will not be, but it has not happened. So the collaboration work, the collaborative works that we are engaging, for example, with the Australians and also with the French, is so much that brought the success here. In fact, the Australian, the zero chance policy is very, I would say, the robust arrangement that made these numbers lower here. So I think, that's answers
It
your
does.
question.
It does. Thank you so much. And I think that observation about the intersection between people smuggling and human trafficking is really, excuse me, is really important for us to consider here today. I think it's also important to think about the drivers of both of those activities, people smuggling and human trafficking. It's the same drivers, it's the same levels of inequality, the lack of opportunity that drives someone to either choose to take that risk or to be tricked into taking that risk. And so, yes, thank you for sharing your observations on that, as well as the Navy's response in dealing with some of those issues. I'll now turn to Major General Kulathunga, who's the Chief of National Intelligence and Chair of the National Anti-Human Trafficking Task Force. Major General, could you tell us a little bit about the task force, as well as sharing some of your insights as to how the human trafficking risks that Sri Lankans face, particularly when they're migrating abroad?
Thank you, Serena. At the very outset, let me thank the Capital Maharaja Group for organizing this wonderful platform for us, especially from the government sector, to inform the public what actions that the government has taken to prevent this heinous crime in Sri Lanka. Now, we have been discussing from the morning about the crime, the human trafficking and smuggling. Now, it is my turn as the head of the Officials Committee of the National Anti-Human Trafficking Task Force in Sri Lanka to inform this forum as well as the public what actions that we have taken so far and what is the strategy that we have adopted in Sri Lanka to prevent this. Now, in Sri Lanka, the National Anti-Human Trafficking Task Force was established in 2010 with a cabinet decision, and it was under the Ministry of Justice until 2021. Then in 2021, again a decision was taken by the Cabinet of Ministers to give the leadership to the Ministry of Defense. Obviously, it is the reason mainly for the purpose of combining intelligence subject into this crime and how the intelligence is going to be used as a tool to prevent this in the country. So the Ministry of Defense got the leadership in 2021, and since then we have been engaging with a lot of programs, and we have been collaborating with various organizations, including the Bali process and various countries where we have a problem of getting back our illegally trafficked people from Sri Lanka. Now, the Anti-Human Trafficking Task Force in Sri Lanka, since established in 2010, have been progressing well, but due to the fact that the conflict in Sri Lanka was there, and the aftermath to the conflict, we have been having a huge exodus of peoples going out of the country for obvious reasons. And this has been out of control during that time. So however, with the stabilization of the situation, somewhere in between 2015 and 2019, we were able to get a lot of results through this task force. However, in the TIP report, Sri Lanka was downgraded to Tier 2 watch list. And thanks to all the agencies and the ministries engaged with the task force, we have 21 agencies, 21 stakeholders in our task force. Because of their dedication and commitment, we were able to upgrade ourselves to Tier 2 in 2022. So it's an achievement itself. Of course, TIP report is something physically we show your progress, but the crime is still happening in different levels. Now, specifically to address the Sri Lankan issue, the main problem that Sri Lankan migrant workers facing is the illegal trafficking of people to various countries on false promises, and they've been mainly trafficking to various countries. Earlier stage, it was in the Middle East, where they've been given false promises saying that a different opportunity for the work, but they have been trafficked. At the end, they found themselves that they have been trafficked. We have classic cases in Oman, where we were able to bring down more than 20 workers who have been trafficked to Oman, especially the women. So here we got the IOM as a partner, very strong partner, still we have, and they supported the government to bring them down to Sri Lanka. So this is only one classic case that I am saying. And sexual exploitation, labor exploitation. Then the latest one is the mercenary, the ex-service personnel of Sri Lanka being trafficked to the Russian borders, the Ukrainian borders, where they've been forced to occupy the frontline positions where they were not told at the beginning that they are going for this particular job. So now we have a huge problem of getting these people back to the country. So now presently the government of Sri Lanka and government of Russia is engaged with discussions, and they are very successful. We have come to an agreement that hereafter no one from the three services, ex-servicemen, will be taken to the forces in Russia. And these are the actions that we have already taken into the contemporary questions that we have. Now, the strategy that we have adopted at the National Anti-Human Trafficking Task Force is that based on the strategic national action plan. Now, we have planned up to 2025, and the beyond that, the next 5 years is also now been planning. The action plan, the strategic action plan has 4 areas. Prevention, the first one, protection, prosecution, and partnership. So these are the 4 pillars that we are working on this strategic action plan. And the action plan also augmented with a national a policy. That is the policy that the government has already adopted, approved and adopted. So this policy has been given to all the ministries, all the agencies in the government to follow. And the task force is now engaged in taking this message across to the entire government sector by conducting workshops with the help of the private sector and also the NGOs, especially IOM. We have very successfully conducted ground level training programs for the local government agents like the Grama Sevakas, then district secretaries, then the divisional secretaries. So likewise. So all the districts in Sri Lanka we have covered. Then the second tier of training is giving the awareness program for the tri-service personnel, the senior officers, which we have done last week. And we are now planning to have senior officials training program, awareness training program for all the government ministries and institutes, the divisional, the secretaries. So that will happen tomorrow. So at the Goldface Hotel. So all these awareness programs, I guess, will give a fair knowledge to the government sector as to what action that the national action, the Human Trafficking Task Force is taking. Now that is not enough. We need to get on board the private sector and also the business sector. So this is a very good forum that I think to take across our message, the task force message, to the business forum, and how to get their support into preventing and protecting our people in this country. So I think we can discuss further in time to come.
Wonderful. Yes, we'd love to do that, and we're very happy, I think, on behalf of the Government and Business Forum to offer our support and to understand how we can help you to do that, but also learn from your experiences in running these trainings and consultations. I think what you're doing here in Sri Lanka could be really valuable for other countries in the Bali Process region. So we would love to feed in that experience so that we can all learn from it. And yes, there's lots of business leaders here, many from the private sector, and I think we'd like to continue that collaboration with government. So thank you for your comments on that. I'll now turn to Mr. Jake Sims. Mr. Sims, you've got a wealth of experience working on these issues, and in particular, and from what I understand more recently, you've been focusing on forced scamming in the region. So I'd like to ask you a little bit about that. We've heard about the global concern that has been rising around cyber scams and online fraud, but also noting that often the people who are carrying out these scams are exploited themselves. We know this is proliferating across our region and that it's happening in Sri Lanka too. Just in April this year, 8 Sri Lankans were repatriated from Myanmar after being offered false jobs and trafficked into forced scamming. So can you tell us a little bit more about this rapidly emerging form of trafficking and tell us how it differs from other forms of trafficking and modern slavery, in particular, who is most at risk?
Sure. Thanks, Serena. And thank you to the Bali Process, Capital Maharaja Group, Sri Lankan government for having me today. It's an honor to be here and to see the commitment that is clearly just pouring out of this room, and it's amazing to be here. So, yeah, as you alluded, cross-border trafficking in this region has followed a very consistent pattern for decades. And while it's incorrect to say there's a single profile of a victim, typically you're looking at people who are amongst the most vulnerable in society, people who are amongst the least educated, frequently amongst the most rural, and from smaller, more fragile countries moving to larger economies in the region. That's the dominant mode that we've observed for a really long time. But what we are seeing today is, in recent years, actually, the explosion of something very, very different. And as Ambassador Bell alluded to, fragility, technological advancements and adaptations in the ways that criminals are approaching various kinds of fragility that we see in the region are manifesting in new forms of human trafficking. Obviously, fraudulent recruitment can take many, many forms, but you're seeing in the region an explosion of forced criminal activity or trafficking for criminal purposes for the first time, and that is rapidly shifting basically everything we know about this industry and this epidemic of human trafficking that has so many different forms in the region. So I alluded already, geographically, places in the sub-Mekong region like Myanmar, Cambodia, and Laos have for many, many years been the source countries, the origin countries from where people are leaving, where they're fleeing difficult labor rights situations or limited economic opportunities and going into larger economies. But now, not only are their neighbors being drawn into situations of exploitation, but just in the last 3 years, we have recorded, documented cases of people from over 60 different nationalities going to these places that previously did not serve as major destinations for human trafficking. And as Ambassador Bell said as well, this is a very different profile. These are now very urban, multilingual, highly educated people who previously held very stable professional jobs and maybe at one point or for many, many years were not the people that we would assume were most vulnerable to human trafficking. So that is shifting. Third, the modality of human trafficking is changing dramatically, and we're seeing it almost overnight, where previously community-based brokers, friends of friends, second and third degree connections were the primary ones that were driving the abuse and the exploitation. Now, these are predominantly people who have had encounters on social media. And so the mode that is luring people into this industry are people looking for jobs and finding jobs in the tech sector and sales, customer service, or potentially even the gambling industry, applying, going through seemingly legitimate, sophisticated recruitment processes, having their plane tickets purchased for them, and then just finding something very, very different when they arrive. Not arriving at an office complex, but something more revealing, resembling a penal colony. And these are penal colonies, or what we call now scam compounds or fraud compounds that are owned by militia groups in northern Myanmar or oligarchs or criminal investors in Cambodia or Laos. So a very, very different level of, a very different form of recruitment and a very different level of sophistication that we're seeing as well. And what that has yielded, that sophistication, the preying on these fragile contexts and the use of technology has yielded a scale and a concentration of abuse that is far exceeding the precedent from what we've seen in the past. And several people have commented on today how lucrative human trafficking has become. And of course, there are the big numbers globally about how lucrative. But when human trafficking is now tapping into large transnational organized crime activities and tapping into downstream victims in larger, wealthier economies around the world, how lucrative this can be has exploded as well. And so, according to UNHCR, this is potentially a 300,000 person industry around the region. And according to the UN Office of Drugs and Crime and a recent report from the U.S. Institute of Peace, you could be looking at a $40 to $60 billion per year industry in the Mekong sub-region alone. And that is drawing, again, on a workforce not just within that part of the region, but as you mentioned, Sri Lankans being trafficked to Myanmar, to Laos, to Cambodia, which is not a reach of recruitment that human trafficking networks would have had many years ago. And so this exists because of the migration and ascendancy of a very sophisticated class of transnational criminals into the Mekong subregion, which has resulted in furthering fragility, furthering the undermining of good governance and rule of law. And a lot of this also came to a head at the start of the COVID-19 pandemic, when a lot of these criminals were previously aligned with gambling-related activities, and many of the workforce were gainfully employed. Those two things shifted when the gambling industry dried up at the start of COVID, and a lot of those illicit opportunities also dried up for the workforce. And so some of these factors, as well as some of the long-standing gaps in governance, are giving rise to what we're seeing as a golden era of transnational crime and human trafficking in these countries. And the exponents of this are now obviously impacting at a grave level the lives of these hundreds of thousands of victims, but they're also having deeply pernicious effects to economies all over the world. Where you have victims, I think the Interpol Secretary General summed it up best, and I'll close with this, just saying just about anyone in the world could be a victim to this form of crime, either as a human trafficking victim or as a victim of the scams and financial abuse that are being perpetuated out of these compounds. And so that implies a need for a coordinated global response. And it's encouraging to start to see one of those emerge, and the Bali process certainly has been at the forefront of that. So thank you.
Thank you so much, Mr. Sims. Just sticking with you for a moment there, you touched on governance and the rule of law, and also how lucrative forced scamming or cyber scamming in general can be. Can you just tell us a little bit about the challenge that poses, that actually this represents a large part of many countries' GDP now, and the fact that corruption is inevitably involved in order for these scamming centres to exist and for people to be trafficked across borders. You also mentioned, I think when we were speaking earlier, your involvement in Operation Shamrock. Can you share a little bit about how Operation Shamrock is tackling some of those challenges?
Sure, thank you. Yes, and I mean, you've stated it eloquently that corruption is a primary driver of this form of human trafficking, and that has been established at a diffuse level for a long time, but it has not been the case that you see large-scale criminal industries that are owned, operated, and protected systematically by some of the most powerful forces in a country. And that also brings a whole different level of potential scale and sophistication. The research I think you're alluding to, we recently published with the U.S. Institute of Peace, suggests that this could account for over 40% of the GDP in Cambodia, Laos, and Myanmar. And if you think about the ways in which we know that those economies and political environments are structured, that means that a significant portion of that money is actually filtering to the ruling elite in those countries, and maybe at a level of sort of existential regime continuity. There's certainly evidence that these funds, this industry, is fueling and driving the conflict in Myanmar, and that it is fueling and driving the sort of single-party state environments that exist in Cambodia and Laos. And so it's contributing. This is saying corruption is almost the wrong word in this sense. These are sort of elite-driven industries and state-driven industries to an extent. In terms of Operation Shamrock, I sort of close my last comment by saying a coordinated global response is needed. That sort of coordinated global response certainly needs to happen and requires formal, high-level commitments and engagement, and the Bali process has been a vitally important part of that response. But it also is going to require a very broad coalition of informal collaboration amongst a very broad set of stakeholders. And we're here talking about human trafficking. Human trafficking really is just a component of what is one of the most lucrative, large-scale, and sophisticated instances of organized crime in the world today. And so there's cyber components. There's ways that the private sector is being instrumentalized by this. There's, of course, a human trafficking component, a corruption component. There's geopolitical aspects to this. And so me and my partners over the last few months have assembled what is at this point the largest multi-sector coalition of actors aimed exclusively at trying to combat and disrupt this issue while also protect the people who are sitting at the very bottom of this, either the scam victims or the human trafficking victims. And we've assembled local law enforcement partners from around the world, concerned government agencies from a number of regional and global governments, financial institutions, tech firms, human trafficking organizations. And all of these organizations, which we tend to exist in our own space, need to come together, and we need to start moving in alignment and unison, and that's the role that Operation Shamrock is hoping to play. And I hope that that's something that can operate in parallel with some of the higher level dialogue that Bali process is facilitating as well. So thank you.
Wonderful. Yes, we'd absolutely love to continue that conversation with you and Operation Shamrock. And I think that's a good segue to turn back to Lynn. Mr. Sims was giving some really good examples around collaboration in the region on a very specific form of human trafficking. Your role as ambassador to counter people smuggling, modern slavery and human trafficking is much broader than that. Can you share some other examples of how you foster regional collaboration in the region? And I guess in particular, what's next for Bali process? What have we got planned looking forward? How are we going to start to take the next steps to tackle these major challenges?
Thank you. So I guess if I start with my role as Australia's ambassador to counter modern slavery, there are a lot of ways that Australia is working internationally, and I'm sure many other countries in the region too. So if I start at the top, at the multilateral level, these issues obviously raised in the United Nations, and next week in Geneva, the 56th session of the Human Rights Council commences, and there'll certainly be discussion of these issues there. So Australia and many other countries who are represented here and through the Bali process work in that multilateral context. Australia also works through Alliance 8.7, which is very focused on the Sustainable Development Goal Target 8.7 to eradicate modern slavery, the worst forms of child labour, forced labour and trafficking in persons. So Australia is a member of the Global Coordinating Group and the Asia Pacific representative in Alliance 8.7, and Sri Lanka, I'm very pleased to see, is a pathfinder country through Alliance 8.7. There's a number of countries there that are working really specifically on roadmaps to alleviate problems in their countries and economies. So many of us working through the Bali process are also working through different forums to regionally and multilaterally to tackle some of these problems. Australia is also working bilaterally with countries, not just with Sri Lanka and other countries, but for example, I am on the Joint Steering Committee of a new initiative in Thailand, which is the Counter Trafficking in Persons Centre of Excellence, which has just been established and opened, and they're starting to train people through a number of opportunities, particularly on investigating human trafficking and taking very victim-centred approaches to how to embark on those investigations. So capacity building work there that Thailand is doing some great work on. And of course, through the Bali process, Australia is a permanent co-chair with Indonesia, and we're working collaboratively through the region. As Ambassador Tree said in his opening remarks, we had senior officials meetings in Malaysia just in May, and a whole lot of countries come to the table there, including Sri Lanka. So we have the opportunity to think about what the real drivers are and where our focus is in the year going forward. And as you'll know, the Government and Business Forum meetings at senior levels align with ministerial conferences of the Bali process. So the last one was held in Adelaide in 2023, and we'll look forward to the next one. So as we start to move toward that, I think the real practical initiatives, and speaking with one of the business leaders here this morning who had some great ideas, I think, in thinking about this as a cultural issue, something that we need to embed within our organisations, whether we're government officials or whether we're private business or whether we're NGOs, that we embrace this form of cultural change to really seize the momentum on these issues and to work in a concerted way for it every day. I think from the legislative perspective, there's a lot of work happening in countries right across the world thinking about supply chain issues and how we deal with that, whether that's through transparency or other measures. And I mentioned earlier Australia's Modern Slavery Act, which works. That's our own national approach in that way, but it's really good to use this forum, the Government and Business Forum, as well as the Bali process more broadly, to think about how we come together with private sector to really make actionable initiatives. And I think what I take most from listening to all the speakers in this room is that there are so many people who are focused on making real change. And I highlight the efforts of Mr. Siobhan Daniel here, the business leader for Sri Lanka, who is really invested through so many ways, through the government and business program, but in other ways, to really make very practical difference to the lives of people on the ground. So I think the Bali process will continue to look to elevate examples of best practice, to be a platform for sharing information and regional dialogue, and also through the Bali Process Regional Support Office, which is based in Bangkok. And I see one of the co-managers, the Australian co-manager of the RSO, David Scott, is here today. And one of their real focuses is working in practical ways to build capacity of frontline officials right across our region. So we'll continue to work in that way through the Bali process too. Thank you.
Thanks, Lynn. And turning back to you, Commander Pereira, I'd like to understand a little bit more about how the Navy operates in this space, and keeping on the theme of collaboration. What more do you think could be done collaborating with the private sector, either here in Sri Lanka or collaborating with other regional governments to help tackle the problems that you spoke about before?
Yes. Thank you. General Kulatunga mentioned earlier about the amount of work that is underway. So one is, of course, the educating not only the government sector but the public sector about the gravity of this. And now, as we I mentioned earlier, tightening the security around the sea, that it's not easy, but still happening, but it's not easy. But then the other options are available through and often the case is that through visitor visas, people leaving, and then again rearranging at the transit countries where they are waiting months and months to be either smuggled out or while waiting there may be cases of trafficking. How these people are surviving there, engaging in working, whatever. So you mentioned earlier one of the cases and it was mentioned in Myanmar as well, a case of 50 plus Sri Lankan citizens have been deceived and smuggled out there, and then got engaged in or rather really trafficked, because they were engaged in cyber crimes, I would say. Some IT personnel, they're gone. And And then the level of enhancing our own capabilities and, not only within, but as you said, within the region, the sharing of information is so much. Now, we were talking earlier about the Maritime. Now, a few of the cases were, instead of taking the passage from the source country, but, they have taken visa and to the second country, the transit, and, from there taking again the sea passage. Recently there was this case of Lady R3, one of the coasters, I would say very dilapidated condition, has taken about 320 migrants as passengers, taken off to sea from the coast of Myanmar. And off the Manila Sea, this vessel came, was defective, it was non-operation with an engine defect for 10 days, just drifting. Luckily with the SOS nearby car carrier was sent it there for the rescue, and these people were transferred to Vietnam, and many of them returned back now. So in this process, again, let me speak little more about the issues at sea. Now, even in that case, how ships, the ship captains need to act, over a period of time, these operation procedures have been made, what to do. Then regionally, the coastal states are responsible for marine rescue coordination. So these rescue coordination centers have their specific instruction how to deal with. But there is occasionally the case that, such people at sea rescued and found that they are illegal migrants in numbers, their reluctance to leave the ship. You remember, Your Excellency, the case of Tampa in Australia, somewhere around 2001 or 2002. So how to face these situations are, again, a case that, we need to work out well. The IMO and the UNHCR has done wonderfully well on this, working out this. So that was one case. And similarly, we have seen larger numbers illegally migrating to Canada earlier, like 2009, 2012. We have two big cases where nearly 500 people migrated to, using ships. So within the country, the process of, stopping it at sea, it is very important for us to have the domain awareness. We need to have the picture so that the Navy and the Coast Guards act well. But as you said, how the public and the private, it is important in making them understand. And as he said, there are a lot of scams. This is the networks. The involvement are so deep. It's not only one nation. This is in number of countries. They have the links. So it originates from here, but you have the partners somewhere else in these scams. So even when the private companies, when they are to take somebody from another country, they need to be very well aware of the procedures and also to look at cleaner way of getting them. So that is the level of what they are doing in Sri Lanka, educating both the government and the private sector to be aware, knowledgeable on the gravity of this. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Commander Pereira. And I can imagine just from those examples that you provided, you've got the sort of source country, the destination country, and often several transit countries in between. So I imagine the levels of collaboration are very high. So thank you for sharing those examples with us. Major General Kulatunga, I'd like to, you made some remarks earlier about the private sector and how you'd like to work more closely with the private sector, particularly in implementing Sri Lanka's National Action Plan. I'm just curious, what do you think the next steps would be that we could take as the Bali Process Government and Business Forum to support these efforts and engage the private sector here in Sri Lanka?
Serena, before I answer your question, I just want to elaborate. The National Anti-Human Trafficking Task Force in Sri Lanka is collaborating in 4 levels with 4 different sectors. I just want to elaborate on that. The first one is the government-to-government bilateral engagements. Those are MOUs and agreements between the countries, Sri Lanka and another country, which we have already engaged some of the Middle East countries. Now, we engage with these countries on bilateral agreements because we want to have the legal aspect is very clear with the migrants. Then also the repatriate protocol, it helps the protocol. So in terms of that, we engage with these countries in bilateral agreements. So that is the first level of collaboration that we have. The second one is the multilateral cooperation that we have discussed already. So the Bali process is also one of them. Then beyond that, we have the regional organizations like SAARC, then we have ASEAN. So we are engaged with these organizations as well. So now, end of this month, we are going to have the BIMSTEC forum for this subject. So that is being hosted by Sri Lanka and headed by the National Anti-Human Trafficking Task Force. So this is the multilateral level, our collaboration. Then we have the government to business. Government to business collaboration is as a CSR project by some of the business organizations. The purpose of this is to mainly to encourage the business to adopt CSR initiatives that support anti-trafficking efforts and protect the workers, right? So in these companies, in the recruitment of employment, they have been tasked, they have been educated as to how they should follow the regulations, the rules, and the procedures of the country. So this is being done by government to business collaboration. Then we have the third level is the government to civil society collaboration. Now this cooperation is basically with the NGOs and the civil society organizations. Now at the moment the task force is engaged with a few NGOs and the civil society organizations at the grassroots level, where the civil society organization is able to go to the most rural areas in this country and take the message across of protective measures that they should take and the safe migration. Most importantly that we are not going to prevent the migration at all. The migration has to be on the safe side. So how to engage in safe migration is being educated through the civil society organizations who goes to the ground, go to the village and educate the village level. So that is being monitored by the task force also, and we are engaged with them. So the final one is the technology. It is called the government to technology cooperation. That is very important because today's context where the technology is being used and also abused in various forms, especially in the trafficking scenarios where the social media and other technologies have been used, as he explained very well. This should be educated to the masses, to the people in this country. So there we need the technology cooperation with technology partners, especially how to use AI, how to use the new tools, all these things, because today's young lad in a village is equipped with a smartphone always. Although he is not so educated, he is equipped with that. So that is the tool. Now if it is not being used properly, he can be deceived. He can be put into a trap. And he can be a victim of this heinous crime. So we have to educate them. So where the task force is engaging with the technical partners to have this education at the ground level.
Thank you. And Mr. Sims, I think you spoke a bit about the use of technology here and I guess the threat that it represents. And I think we're seeing technology being used both to recruit workers into sort of more traditional forced labour situations, but also into this fairly new form of forced scamming or forced criminality. What do you see as the opportunities to fight back using technology? I know you said you've been working with some of the major technology providers. Can you share some examples there around how technology can be used to raise awareness or in other ways to actually prevent these crimes from occurring?
Sure, that's a great question. So to be fair, there's lots of ways that technology is enabling this crime. You have, obviously, the social media recruitment. You have the way that financial institutions are being leveraged, telecoms. These telecoms providers are actually the ones where the data is moving back and forth. But you also have new and emerging technologies like AI and machine learning that are actually being used to improve upon how these scams are targeted. In each of those categories, cryptocurrency as well is a massive driver of this. But each of those also present an opportunity. And on the tech platform side, the social media side, the ask, the need, or the potential help that they could provide is pretty straightforward. One, removing the ads and removing the posts that are deemed as fraudulent, that we've all agreed are fraudulent, and that all follow a pretty set standard type of markers. Right now that's happening. It's happening reactively, though. But these tech platforms have the ability to develop algorithms to proactively take these things down, and we're not seeing that happen. And so incentives need to change so that more good faith, proactive involvement could happen. There's also a real need to adjust how we're doing prevention. So used to hotspot type awareness building campaigns are still totally valid because someone moving through an airport could see a banner and realize for the first time, oh, something isn't quite right. But we now have the ability, because of how you can hyper-target fraudulent ads, you can also hyper-target awareness-building ads. If we know, which we do now, the parts of, not just the country of Sri Lanka, but we know where in Sri Lanka people are vulnerable to this sort of crime, we can actually target ad placements, building awareness before they fall into that crime in the exact location that we know they're being exploited. So that's the tech side. On the financial institution side, traditional forms of consumer-facing fraud protection will not work for this because the type of scam that's being perpetrated here is a long con romance or investment scam. And so by the time someone goes to their bank to withdraw the money, by the time that happens, they either believe that they have found a once-in-a-generation financial guru or someone who loves them deeply. And so you have to be much more proactive and contextualized about the type of fraud prevention activities. And again, if we're talking about human trafficking, we want to eradicate human trafficking, we have to raise the cost or lower the profit margin of doing this type of work. And so fraud prevention then becomes a form of indirect human trafficking prevention. And so thinking outside the box in those sort of ways. And then there are more obvious interventions that need to happen on the telecom side. We know which platforms, we actually know where these compounds are. And so it becomes a fairly straightforward technical challenge, but not so much a political or economic challenge to actually shut down access to the internet for the places where this criminal activity is occurring. And that is happening in small places along the Thai border. You previously saw Thai telecoms providers with their fins pointed into Myanmar, into these known hotspots of criminality. The Thai National Bureau of Telecommunications has now, over the last year, they've been efforting to shut these down, and in just recent weeks, we've actually seen progress towards that. But it doesn't have to be transnational cross-border telecoms, proactive engagement. You could see that same sort of denial of service to compounds within domestic situations within Myanmar, whether they're using Starlink, as a sort of novel form of technology, or whether it's just a traditional telecom provider in Laos or in Cambodia. The technical challenge of cutting off access is actually quite straightforward. The political and economic barriers to doing that are more complex. So those
Great.
are a few ideas.
Thank you. Please.
Point that I should not miss is that we were talking about taking the message to the vulnerable people, the community who might get dragged into that. A success story is what us and the Sri Lanka, the Australians are doing together. So this media campaign, the traditional media and also the social media, which is very effectively now been sent to these coastal communities where vulnerabilities are high, to make them aware the consequences of illegally attempting to arrive in Australia. So it is of a very successful story about making awareness to the community, I would say the vulnerable community. Yeah.
So using those same techniques that have been successful in the past and thinking about how we redeploy those in this context. A really interesting observation. I'd also like to just follow up on one comment you made. You said the incentives need to change. And can I put words in your mouth and suggest that perhaps you're saying there needs to be more regulation there, particularly for the tech companies, in that in order to proactively look for these ads and take them down, there needs to be an incentive to do that, and therefore a regulation or a law requiring them to do that. Am I allowed to put those words into your mouth, or would you disagree?
You can put those words in my mouth. I think what I was trying to get at is that actually in the financial institution space and the telecom space, those incentives actually are closer to being aligned. But in the tech space, if you look at a major actor where we know that we could say, of all the human trafficking cases of this form of human trafficking that I or the partner organizations I'm sort of affiliated with have seen, 90+% of them have come from public-facing meta platforms. And taking down known fraudulent ads is one thing, but if you proactively take all those down, you're actually directly undermining the business model. You're undermining high traffic forums. And so there's a misalignment of incentives, but for that to continue being a safe and helpful platform for economies and communities around the world, their business model actually needs to adapt to the reality that it is being used in a profound way to drive and facilitate human trafficking and financial crime. And so yes, regulation is probably needed to help guide and steer the large tech firms in a direction where they are going to be more aligned for more proactive good faith engagement.
Great, thank you.
I'll
Lynn?
probably just add from the Australian context too that Australia has now established an independent regulator, the E-Safety Commissioner, who operates within Australia, and also on the 1st of July last year opened the National Anti-Scam Centre, aimed at assisting those Australians who are targeted by these offshore scam centres too. So I'm sure that work's happening at the national level across many countries to protect your citizens and nationals and to help work in that cyber domain and to help increase awareness and protections for citizens, certainly in Australia and I'm sure in other countries as well. And so sharing what we're doing in those dimensions across Bali Process members is probably another good thing for us to do going forward.
Great, thanks, Lynn. We've got a few minutes left. I might now turn to the audience to see if there are any questions for our panel. I'll give everyone a moment to think. Please raise your hand if you have a question, and there will be microphones available. Everyone's shy. Oh, there's one.
Thank you. My question is for the commander. So in the graph that you showed us of people that were stopped, there was a spike in 2012. And I was just wondering if you could tell us the reasons for that. So was there something that happened that was a push or pull factor within Sri Lanka or internationally that resulted in more people leaving? Or was there more of a mobilisation by the Navy or something else?
Yes, thank you. Yes, the push-pull factors. 2012, if you look at this is almost 3 years to 2.5 plus years after the ending of the protracted conflict of this country. So subsequent situation, these measures, if you look at the numbers, I was mentioning of the 2 events earlier on the Ocean Lady and then the Sun City, 2 events which illegal migrants were taken to Canada. Not from here, but, leaving this country, as we discussed earlier, on visa, and then from a second transit country, they left. Now, this is the time even to Australia, given that, 2 years pace to organize, the experiences of the former party in this conflict, they had the professionalism and the experience in trafficking and transferring at sea. They got nicely organized on these acts. So this was the time that, you saw that huge spike going up in 2012. And then because of the various management, that the country and, of course, from the Australia, that one is towards Australia. So it was brought to control. But again, you have seen that 2022, there is another small spike. Obviously, the economic downturn of this country led to it. So I said that, last 12 months, it's 0 illegal migration out of this country. But then again, as you can see, what the push factor here, what's behind this is basically economic issues. And, if you look at these people who have migrated out and, in certain destination, attempting to obtain the refugee status, they have all migrated on economic reasons. Recently when you're looking at are they the economic migrants? That's what I told earlier. You're arriving as an illegal migrant, but then subsequently what you're subjected to, it may turn out to be a trafficking event, because what these people get at the end. So I hope that I was able to give a reasonable answer to you. Thank you.
Yes, thank you.
There's another question. That's Peppy.
Thanks. Hi, this is Peppy from IOM, and thanks for a really great panel. I have 2 very quick questions. The first one is for the Vice Admiral. So from IOM's experience, we do, of course, awareness-raising campaigns are really important in terms of raising the understanding around risks of irregular migration, as well as opportunities around safe migration. But we do find that using fairly sort of risk-based awareness-raising materials, talking about don't do this, don't do that, that's dangerous, isn't as effective as talking about opportunities and possibilities of safe and regular migration. And so I'm wondering whether you are able to combine those 2 in your approaches, and if you see that being more effective than just talking about the risks. And the other question is for Jake, with the words that were put to your mouth on more regulation needed, couldn't agree more. But we've seen that the tech industry hasn't really come together at all, sort of even just as an industry body discussing this informally, which we usually see in the private sector when they're trying to prevent too much regulation from being imposed on them. And I'm wondering, what could we do to maybe start some of that voluntary discussions amongst the tech companies to start talking about how they could be proactively preventing it? Thanks.
As far as the Vice Admiral and the other parties, the law enforcement parties are involving what we are doing is conveying the preventive message, the repercussion of what will happen if you leave. But that's us. But as a country, we are doing much more better in that, we are looking forward the futuristic aspects of preparing our labor force here to match international workforce qualifications. So these are some futuristic, even we're looking at the education revisions to match, so that what you're saying in that case is the country is looking at preparing our labor force so that they can migrate for better opportunities if they go out legally. So that message is also been, to a greater extent, is passed through around, and there are a lot of attempting to migrate out legally, with the openings that are given by various Western countries, the European Union, and many of the other countries. Thank you.
Okay, very quickly, I see sort of three opportunities. One, this is a unique situation where you have this profound lack of regulation that's actually driving regulatory risk in another industry. And the Australian financial institutions, I think through the Australian Banking Association and some other mechanisms, have actually been proactively calling tech firms, both calling for regulation on tech firms, but also calling them to the table. And so I think this cross-sectoral private sector engagements are starting to happen. I think that's really promising. Second, there actually was, I think last week of May, there was announced an initiative called Tech Against Scams, Coinbase, Ripple, Meta, a few others. Notably, though, if you look at the sort of driving agencies within these corporations that are leading this is being led by sort of public relations departments, not sort of policy reform elements of these organizations. And so I do think they are starting to come to the table, and if we can find ways to engage there, I would certainly recommend that the organizers of Tech Against Scam to enlist the support of private sector or civil society observers and partners, international organizations who are engaged in this space that could help advise and drive that sort of nascent movement in the right direction. And then the last one I would say is this, because of a lot of the overt push and sort of negative press that's going against the tech sector right now, I do think this situation I think it behooves itself to the sort of informal partnerships that we are building towards and moving towards at Operation Shamrock, where we don't necessarily need an upfront commitment. I think there are other channels that can provide that. We need sort of the back channel working level relationships to interject ideas and creativity into that space for how they might be able to proactively head off some of the coming wave of regulation, which I think is going to come sort of either way. But how do they best respond and start signaling good faith in advance of that? And I do think there are some channels open for that. So if there are certainly IOM or others in the room who are interested in engaging in some of those sort of channels of dialogue that are opening up, feel free to come chat with me, and we'd love to have you involved and a part of that movement as well as this one. So thank you.
Wonderful, thank you. And I think on that note, I'll wrap us up. I can see a big clock which is blinking 0 at me. So I'd like to thank all of our panelists for sharing their insights. I think we covered a lot of ground today, a lot of ocean as well, Commander. And really, really appreciate you all being here. On behalf of the Government and Business Forum Secretariat, I look forward to continuing discussions with each of you and on the initiatives that you all mentioned today. So thank you.